Yes, I've done that.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to introduce Rahul, who is a very, very old friend. That's a language issue there. He is not old. We know each other for a long time. That's doesn't look old. It started our interaction and association started while Rahul was working with McKinsey. He was one of the handpicked and sought after strategy consultants in McKinsey, where he has chosen mostly to work with strategy projects. And we had a lot of opportunity to partner and learn from him while he was in McKinsey. But the relationship continued after that. Rahul, unlike many McKinsey people, who many years ago was enamored and excited about the tech world, and he left to start his technology firm. He started a startup, but he continued helping organizations and other startups from a consultant perspective. And currently based in Canada, work across the globe, coaching CEOs, working with senior leadership teams, helping them in formulating strategy, problem solving, hand holding, and coaching. Many of you would have gone through some kind of a coach training. Only when Rahul came to attend to that coach certification, I realized he already had embodied a coaching level. He's a little bit a Buddha kind of a guy. So he had that coaching already. He used to listen more, ask specific question. But just for the group's sake, he's also exposed to coaching methodology. So it's like a killer, powerful blend of a strategy, problem solving, blend of brain with a coaching and a deep listening approach. So when we were looking at who we could call to do this session, we always we had a challenge because we have worked with a large number of people in McKinsey, and there are always a lot of people who are keen to address this group because they know that the group is full of rock stars. But then Rahul was the right fit. And the only challenge was because of Rahul's time difference, and he's in Canada. And COVID, I have seen making one person extremely busy, that is Rahul. Even if we want to talk, we figure it out, and Rahul will say, after 3 weeks, maybe we can block some time. So he's really using this time to support and help his clients. There are some large Indian corporations where we work with the leadership team and CEOs, and he coaches them, support them in the overall transformation and strategy. So that is Rahul Bhargava Unplugged for you.
Thank you so much, Santosh. And after this introduction, I'm just wondering, I had just one page and with 3 bullets about me. I'm going to skip that because I can't do any justice after what you have spoken about me. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this session, to be with you on this specific topic that has been given to me, which is approach to problem solving. I'm just going to display my screen so that we are on the same page on what I'm going to speak about. I do want to make sure that there are no other expectations. So, as Santosh mentioned, I worked at McKinsey for a number of years, little over 6 years. And then for the last 8 years, I've been doing two things. One, I've been running my own firm by the name Purple Crest, which is a corporate strategy and digital focus management consulting firm, currently based out of Toronto, with operations in India as well as North America. So we work with organizations which are having problems specific to running their operations in India, or organizations which are looking at expanding or entering into North America. These are two focus areas. Within the operations, strategy, digital, and overall performance management becomes the focus. Like Santosh mentioned, I have also done a lot of work in the technology space with startups, both as an advisor, investor, as well as working on a couple of ideas of my own. So that gives a good perspective of problems from A, different size of organization, B, different types from a sectoral perspective, and C, from a function perspective. I have tried to gather as much as knowledge as possible over the last 14, 15 years, not only on one aspect, which is strategy, but also other aspects, which includes finance, which includes talent, because when it comes to business, when it comes to strategy execution, I've realized that a lot of strategies, they fail because on paper they look fantastic, but when it comes to implementation, they don't consider other aspects which are very practical in creating a success out of that strategy. So that's a bit about me. Let's start by first looking at some sort of a context. Give me your response on these two questions in the chat window. Why learn problem solving at all? And second, what are your learning expectations from the session today? I hope everyone has access to the chat window and they can do that. So I'll wait for 2 minutes maybe for you to type in your answers. Thank you. I'm just going through some of the responses. Someone said no life without problem solving. I could not agree more. Okay, so this is also to make sure that whatever I'm going to say is on the expected lines, and I have not prepared myself too much off from the expectations. I think most of you are expecting somewhat similar to what I'm going to cover. So I won't go through all the comments, but I think I'll just read one or two so that everyone understands if they are not looking at the chat window. So Deepika mentioned why problem solving. From diagnosis that we learned in our earlier sessions, now we are moving to solving problems from an OD lens. So I think that's a good perspective, good expectation to have, given that this entire training is focused on OD. And Rashmi mentioned have a basic frame and approach. That's the expectation from session today. I think we'll cover that. And last one, Yogesh mentioned, end of the day, the problem which needs to be solved has to be solved. I want to understand the experience of problem solving and get perspectives. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think that's helpful. Let me go back to my screen now. So I'm going to add two more perspectives to what all of you have shared. One perspective is from a think tank. World Economic Forum had a view which they shared a few years back on this. And second is from a person who some of you might be able to relate with, that if that person has created success, is there a role that problem solving has played? So the person I'm going to share about is Elon Musk. And in case you know Elon Musk, he has created organizations which are vastly successful. That's one part, which is not very different from a lot of other entrepreneurs. But what is so spectacular about him is that he has done it across very different sectors. So he started with PayPal in the financial services space. He created something in the space technology with his SpaceX. He created an automobile company with Tesla. So these are like so varied sectors that most of the people that we generally come across, they are specialists in one particular domain, one sector, and they do exceptionally well. That's not uncommon. Like all of us here, we are also very, very focused on becoming, say, a fantastic OD professional, an exceptional HR professional, a strategy guy. Say, in my case, I might say that there are one or two sectors where I try to focus on. But this guy, he has created some fantastic success across three different, very different sectors. So it's good to understand how he thinks, and is if there is a role of problem solving in his approach. So these are two that I'm gonna share next. Let me start with the first one. Uh, Complex problem solving is the number one skill in the present and the near future as per World Economic Forum. So they came out with a report called Future of Jobs, Employment Skills and Workforce Strategy for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And in that, they came out with 10 skills which would be most relevant in this fourth industrial revolution. Complex problem solving came out on top, followed by critical thinking, which to me forms a subset within the complex problem solving skill set. Creativity, which again, when we are generating solutions for any problem, creativity as a sub skill gets applied. And then some of those you are more familiar with, but the top three, I would say that they are falling in the broader bucket of complex problem solving. Let's also take a pause and think of that while this study was done in 2016, it came out as a report and it still remains relevant. In fact, the title of that study, if I'm not mistaken, was skills that would be relevant by 2020. And I see that some of these have become even more relevant because of few other developments that have happened over the last 3 or 4 years. One is the space of growth of digital and automation, where now so much of tasks have been taken over by use of technology in a different way, that we need to think very differently from what we learned in our schools or we learned from our prior experience. Because when we were learning at that point of time, digital and analytics was not so prevalent in terms of usage. Theoretically, so I'm a computer science engineer by education, so probably theoretically I would have read a lot about technology back in my engineering days. But the applications are now happening. Today, at the tap of a button, I can do so much, which I could not do 20 years back. And that changes the way I should be conducting my business, the way I should be thinking about problems. So that's one, that over the last 3 or 4 years, this has accelerated at an even higher pace, and which means that I need to apply the thinking very, very differently. And that's where the complexity comes in, that there are routine problems and there are non-routine problems. Non-routine problems with more variables are what I would call as those areas where complexity is there, and hence you need to apply problem solving differently. Second, COVID. So if I look at COVID and try to figure out a pattern over the last 10 or 12 years, the number of times that we have been hit by some or the other disruption, it has become higher. Probably earlier disruptions of this kind of scale, whether it was 2008, whether it's now, whether it's 2001, they used to happen at a lower frequency. So probably, and I'm not predicting a future here, but probably disruptions would keep happening at a higher frequency, which means that my way of thinking has to keep evolving and keep transforming at a faster pace than I used to. So earlier, if I used to create a framework, I used to create a framework that here is a framework for me to grow, for my sales to grow, for my talent to grow. I can apply that framework for probably my entire career. Then came a phase where we said that, okay, certain frameworks I could apply probably till midpoint for the next 10 years, for the next 15, 20 years, and then another framework will come in because things have changed. I think now it's even faster, that if I think of a framework, probably it would be applicable for the next couple of years, and then I'll have to rethink, because the world is going to change at a much faster pace. So many behaviors have changed in the last 3 months, which otherwise would have taken 5 years to 10 years. Whether I look at consumer, whether I look at how talent is behaving, or whether I look at some of the vendor partners of organizations are. So I can't apply a framework which I learned last year in current scenario. So that's the second point around the impact of COVID and other disruption. And the third one, probably a minor one right now, but the way remote work will pan out, again, the nature of problems would be very different from the routine problems we have solved for talent, which means that if I'll give one short example where I was interacting with a client of mine, and they said that, everyone talks about the challenge of transitioning from normal in-office work to remote work. For us, the challenge is actually one level deeper in two different forms. One is the folks who are really good in the in-office environment. They are somehow able to become even more productive in a remote kind of a setting, because these are people who are driven internally. Hence, they are able to produce much more output because they are able to save the commute time, the distraction in the office by being at home. So problem number one for me is that how do I now utilize and engage this resource much more effectively, given that we have transitioned to remote work? So it's a very different kind of a problem compared to just transitioning to remote work. The second problem is on the other end of the spectrum, people who used to be productive because probably their productivity was also rooted in the fact that they were around people. Now they are not with people and their productivity has gone down. So it's a productivity problem with two different ends of the spectrum. One, how do I engage my super productive guy who has become even more productive? Whatever they used to do in say 8 hours, now they are doing it 4 or 5 hours and they're asking, what else we can contribute in. And the other end are those people who I used to, in my talent curve, I used to put them in average or above average. They have suddenly gone down. How do I solve for that? Now, it's not something where you can apply an old methodology and say that this is how I'm going to engage my talent. Because A, this talent probably, some of them are going to be remote. They will not come back to office. And two, it's a different problem. That problem is saying that how do I engage a person who was already productive? How do I engage that guy? Now, for a lot of people, and specifically with this client, this is a unique problem. And it can't be like solved by just applying an existing framework or a methodology. And it's again a case of how do you apply first principles problem solving to solve this. Which brings me to my next sharing, which is Elon Musk and first principles thinking. So here's a short video. It's about, I think, actually not very short, but I think it's about 3-4 minutes or 5 minutes, I've forgotten now. But let's just see what Elon Musk is sharing with Kevin Rose. Kevin Rose was interviewing Elon Musk.
And then I think it's also important to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. So the normal way that we conduct our lives is we reason by analogy. We're doing this because it's like something else that was done, or it's like what other people are doing.
Me too type ideas.
Yeah, slight iterations on a theme, and it's kind of mentally easier to reason by analogy rather than from first principles. But by first principles is kind of a physics way of looking at the world, and what that really means is you kind of boil things down to the most fundamental truths, and say, okay, what are we sure is true, or as sure as possible is true? And then reason up from there. That takes a lot more mental energy.
Give me an example of that. Like, what's one thing that you've done that on that you feel has worked for you?
Sure. So somebody could say, in fact, people do, that battery packs are really expensive, and that's just the way they'll always be, because that's the way they've been in the past. You're like, well, no, that's pretty dumb, because if you applied that reasoning to anything new, then you wouldn't be able to ever get to that new thing.
Right.
It's like you can't say, horses, nobody wants a car because horses are great and we're used to them and they can eat grass. There's lots of grass all over the place, and there's no gasoline that people can buy. So people are never gonna get cars.
Right.
People did say that. And for batteries, they would say, oh, it's going to cost, historically it's cost $600 per kilowatt hour, and so it's not going to be much better than that in the future. And you say, no, okay, well, what are the batteries made of? So first principles we say, okay, what are the material constituents of the batteries? What is the spot market value of the material constituents? So you can say, okay, it's got cobalt, nickel, aluminum, carbon, and some polymers for separation, and a steel can. So break that down on a material basis and say, okay, what if we bought that in the London Metal Exchange, what would each of those things cost? Like, oh, geez, it's like $80 per kilowatt hour. So clearly, you just need to think of clever ways to take those materials and combine them into the shape of a battery cell, and you can have batteries that are much, much cheaper than anyone realizes.
Okay. Can anyone share in the chat through that battery example, what is your understanding of first principle? Break a problem into fundamental elements, breaking assumptions down, challenging status quo. I'm just reading out some of the comments. Get the basics and understand the fundamentals. Dig deeper into the obvious problem statement. Yeah, breaking the assumption down. Go beyond the fact and find the truth. Go to the basic building blocks in question, challenging the basic assumptions. Yeah, I think so. Probably almost everyone got it. So yes, so first principles problem solving is about challenging the inherent assumptions that are there when anyone says this is a problem. So if it is a problem, first principle thinking is about questioning the underlying assumption why that became a problem. And you don't apply it in routine. So that's where I would want to separate out. Firstly, before we dig into any kind of framework, I also want to differentiate between when we should be applying a framework for problem solving, complex problem solving, and when we should not be. I think in general, we face problems every day in our life, whether it's work, whether it's home, we face problems. But there are a number of problems both at work as well as at home, which are routine problems. And we have created certain heuristics in our mind where we don't have to think hard. We know it's a problem, but we know how to do it. So that's where I would have a heuristic that I want to reach office on time. How do I reach office on time? It's a problem, but I know it because I've been solving it on a daily basis. So if I did 5 things to reach office on time, if I still get late, I'll probably change one of those 5, or I will add a 6th thing on top of that. But I know it's a routine problem. So this is where the heuristics part comes in, and that's different from where you would apply first principles. First principles typically get applied when it's a non-routine kind of a problem, or the number of variables are higher, like for example, COVID. Now we have been accustomed to doing certain things a certain way. Now with COVID, we have so many unknowns. I don't know how my employees are going to behave, my peers are going to behave, my boss is going to behave, my customer is going to behave. Lockdown, whether it will get lifted in my locality where I'm living, lockdown, whether it will get lifted in the factory which I'm operating or the office that I'm operating, flights, whether they will operate or not. So many variables, so many unknowns. Now it's a non-routine problem. I have not solved it. So this is where a first principle thinking would get applied when you are trying to solve a problem. A problem in this case could be, how do I ensure that my sales doesn't get disrupted in spite of COVID? Now that's a problem that a business would want to solve, but the unknowns are very different from a routine way of tackling this particular problem. Because if had it been a pre-COVID world, then I would have answered this by saying that let's look at the past historical data, let's look at competition, and let's see how to increase the sales. Or how do I improve my talent retention? The answer to this question in a pre-COVID world would have been very straightforward. There are 5 or 10 things that you would do, and you would be able to improve your talent retention. But in a COVID kind of a situation, the number of variables are high. So this brings me to my this slide, which is again forming the context that at the end of the day, problem solving is answering this one simple question: what should I do? Whether it's in your personal life or it's in office, you are at the end of the day, most problems you are trying to answer, what should I do for a particular scenario? And on the left hand side, I'm displaying that there are simple, routine, repeated pattern type problems where you don't need complex problem solving. Like this example of how do I reach office on time? You've done it a number of times. You would know how to solve that problem. It's a very easy one. This is not what I'm going to focus on in the discussion today, because then it becomes a very elaborate, lengthy process of arriving at a very simple answer, which already would be there on your face. We are looking at the right hand side. We are looking at those problems which are complex, where uncertainty is high and probably stakes are also high. Like in an organization, when we are talking about how do I retain my talent, how do I retain my top talent, which might leave because of what's happening with COVID. Now the stakes are high. If I lose my top 50 guys in a 500 people organization, it's a big impact. If I have to think of how do I retain them in the COVID environment, the complexity and uncertainty is very high. I might think of certain interventions, but I might not be able to implement, because if the lockdown is not lifted, then I have to think of a different scenario compared to when the lockdown has been lifted. So these situations, they require an approach that addresses 4 to 5 parameters that matter in decision making. So compared to a simple decision making, here you might have realized in your experience as well that the solution consists of, and if you look at the bottom of the page, this is what I've tried to display. There is a dollar value attached, that there is a certain budget which puts constraint number 1, that whatever solution I'm thinking of, it has to be within a budget. Second, technically it has to be a sound solution. Third, I need to think of management processes that are there in my organization to make it practical. That if I work, or my way of working in my organization is a particular type, then how do I make sure that whatever solution is thought of, it can be managed within that process? And to give an example, I can bring a tech solution which a startup would be able to apply in a large organization if they don't understand what agile methodology is. It will fail. It will fail, because the way startups develop a product is through continuous iteration. For them, iteration is like in weeks. For a large organization, when they start iterating, they would think, okay, for this year, iteration 1, next year, iteration 2. It will fail. So that's the second part, that the management process. Third is action mindset. Very, very important, that if answer to any problem is not leading to an action or a mindset to take action, then that means that I have created a theoretical answer. When you ask, how do I retain my talent, and I give you an answer and it doesn't make you take action, then that means that I failed. I might have given you a fantastic theoretical answer, but if it is not resulting in an action mindset, it's a failure. And the last one, where I've just depicted people. So it's basically around what kind of people and capability do I have. So I have to marry these 4 or 5 parameters when I'm coming out with a solution to a problem. And you can almost say, here is a problem, here is a solution which kind of combine these 4 or 5 parameters, and in between what is there is your framework of complex problem solving. Any questions so far? Yes, Saparna. How does it work?
Saparna is correct.
Sorry?
Saparna is correct. I didn't understand what you meant by action mindset. Are you saying that solution that I provide has to have an action at the end of it? It has to generate an action at the end of it? Or are you saying that there has to be a mindset for action?
This is a former one, but the way I will articulate is, let's say that you at your organization gave me a problem that...
Sorry, I can't hear you. There is a lot of background.
Okay. So I've understood your question, Saparna. So the way I will articulate is that, let's say that your organization gave me a problem that I am finding talent retention to be a big risk in the COVID times. Can you help out with a solution? And I come with a solution. Action mindset is about that when finally, when I've done everything and I'm communicating the solution to you, does it lead to an action on your part?
Okay.
So am I creating a mindset which is action oriented, or am I creating, let me not even say creating, or am I leaving you behind with just a document that here is a solution, Saparna, and you will keep that a document in a cabinet, and you'll say, okay, fine, I have a nice looking document with me on this particular problem, and job done. So that's the difference. A good solution is always going to lead to an action, and that action comes from the mindset that gets created or gets shifted as part of the problem solving process.
Okay.
So I'll move forward. In case there are more questions, please type into your chat. What we do is, in interest of time, once I've covered my framework, I'll have a look at the questions and I'll try to answer those before we go into a breakout. There's a breakout as well. So anyone who is not paying attention, please pay now, because if you have missed out so far, it's okay. If you miss out now, you won't be able to do a case study which will come, and hence please pay attention from now onwards. Okay, so here's a framework which we okay, before I display this, sorry, just to put a context. So there are multiple frameworks, by the way, and this session is called an approach to problem solving. I'm going to share just one approach which I have been using because of, you can say, my experience and the conviction I have on this particular approach. McKinsey uses this approach very well, and that's how I got groomed. There are other approaches also. For example, people might have heard of design thinking. Now, design thinking also is a way or an approach to solve a problem. So similarly, there are more. It's not the approach, it's an approach. And that's one I would suggest, because I have found this one to be pressure tested with so many clients, so many situations in my own personal first-hand experience at McKinsey, outside of McKinsey, that I am a big believer of this approach, that this can be adopted in multiple situations. Maybe, when you are building a product, then I would say that it has to be a combination of this plus some other approaches like design thinking. But otherwise, most of the situations I have found this to be a great one. So this is called 7 steps to problem solving. And here is how it looks like. Step number 1, problem statement. Step number 2, breaking down the issue. Step number 3, prioritization. 4th, developing a work plan. 5th, analytics. 6th, synthesis. 7th, communication. Now notice 2-3 things. For a lot of people, when they were sharing their responses in the chat, problem solving was about analysis. Notice how analytics is just one step out of the 7. Problem solving is not only analytics. Second thing, notice how synthesis and communication are part of problem solving. For a lot of us, communication happens that once I have created a solution, it's about communicating. No. In this framework, specifically, communication is part of problem solving. I create a solution, which is, I would call a draft solution. I come to you, I communicate it to you, take your inputs, I go back and try to refine. So through the communication, I'm trying to refine the solution. Why do I do that? Because all of us as humans have biases. Confirmation bias, availability bias. You would know much more as part of probably the course that you're doing here, and otherwise also, that biases are inherent in our nature. It's basically part of how we have developed as a human being. So it's natural. We can't fight those biases. But what we can do is, through certain techniques, we can make sure that when we are coming out with a solution, it is as free as possible from the biases. So communication plus working in teams with diversity is one way that I bring a particular thinking, you bring another angle to the same problem, and together we are able to overcome biases that each of us might have. And when we are communicating to, say, the audience, whether it's a CEO, whether it's your boss, whether it's your peers, again, when they give input, then it's basically again challenging some of the biases that might have been built in by us as a team, which the audience is able to challenge. So communication is part of the process and not the step that gets taken after. No. So that's the second thing I want to highlight on this particular page. Anything else I want to highlight? Yeah, I think while preparing for this, someone told me that this session is about MECE. And I said that, no, this is not just about MECE. So MECE is a term which probably got famous by McKinsey. MECE stands for mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So that's only step number 2, where when you're breaking down the issue, you try to apply that. But as you can see from this particular diagram, problem solving is much, much more than just taking care of MECE. And those who could not understand that part, I'll cover that. We'll be covering that. So it's very important that all the 7 steps are applied when you're trying to deal with a complex problem. There has been a lot of thinking, a lot of experience, a lot of wisdom that has gone behind creation of this particular framework. And I'm a big believer that if you're missing out any of the steps, you are actually doing an injustice to the way a complex problem should be solved. And that's why I go back to my previous page also. This is not for every problem. This is not for every problem. Over time, you might become better in applying this to normal problems also, because then you become faster. You are able to break down issues very fast, prioritize, analyze, synthesize, etc. very, very fast. But otherwise, since it takes a lot of energy, mental energy, team energy, etc., be selective. But wherever you are applying, whenever you have selected a particular problem where you have to apply, then apply all the 7. Okay, let's look at one example. So we'll cover one example and then we'll get into the case study. So I just made this yesterday when I was thinking about this session. I thought, okay, it's COVID, and let's take something which is a personal problem. So I keep hearing from folks in my network, should we buy in the next 30 days so that we can monitor oxygen levels of family members? This is basically so that, in case we need to take them to the hospital, we know. So let's take that this is a problem statement. So the first step of my framework was problem statement. Why is it important? It's important because if I have not understood what I need to solve for and why I have need to solve for, I would do all my effort, all the remaining 6 steps, and then realize that I did not even understand the problem properly. So it's a very, very important step. And at McKinsey, I learned about going so deep into it that it became annoying. There was a specific sheet that we used to use, which was just about dissecting the problem statement into different parts. And I used to get annoyed. Why we are focusing so much? And then I realized it used to save so much of work later on if this sheet was drawn properly. What are the 2-3 things that definitely come out if this is done well? One is definition of success. We are solving for a problem. Sure, your boss has given a problem, you have given a problem to your team, your peers, but what is the definition of success? What does success look like if this problem gets solved? So that is one output that comes typically from defining a problem statement properly. Second, constraints. Under what constraints do I have to work? Like in this particular problem, if you look at in the next 30 days, a decision has to be taken in the next 30 days. There is a timeline, time angle to it. In some cases, there is a budget angle to it. In some cases, there's a people angle to it. So understanding the constraints is important before you launch into analytics, because otherwise you would do analytics which is independent of the constraint, and you'll realize I had to, the solution you might have created for this particular problem could be that, fine, you should buy an oximeter, pulse oximeter, but the time frame for your solution could be after 4 months. But in this case, the problem that is being asked from you is that should we buy in the next 30 days or not? So constraints is the second thing that comes out typically when you go through this particular exercise and try to create a good problem statement. The third is dependencies. And in an organization, we are all working as part of a team. Even at a CEO level, I've seen that dependencies are on the board at times. So there are dependencies always, whether in the personal life or in the organization, there are dependencies. So a good problem statement also brings out the dependencies that you might have. Like in this case, is there a dependency on certain family members? Their behavior, the way they conduct themselves, where they are geographically, etc., etc. Right? So a good problem statement would take care of definition of success, constraints, and dependencies for sure. But at the end of the day, it helps you and whosoever you are solving the problem for. It helps both of you to align. So many of my discussions, they always, one full hour is only spent on problem statement. The client might come and say that, Rahul, can you please help on this? And I say, sure. But then instead of coming out with any solution, we spend 1 hour only on this step, problem statement. And the client realizes, while they knew they needed Rahul's help or my firm's help, but in that session, they also became clearer where exactly they need help. So that's step 1. Step 2 is the issue breakup. So let's try to break this. Should we buy a pulse oximeter? Now I can divide this into multiple ways. This is not the way only, the only way. Here is my breakup. Is the payoff attractive financially? If I'm spending 2,000 rupees on a pulse oximeter, is the financial payoff attractive? Is it worth spending 2,000 bucks? Second, is it worth purchasing in 30 days? So notice that I took it from the problem statement. That why is 30 days being talked about? Is it worth purchasing 30 days, or can I, do I need to purchase earlier or late? Can I afford to purchase it later? And the third, will the readings be accurate to take decisions? Why did I come to this particular part? Because what is the problem saying? So that we can monitor oxygen levels of family members. So I try to think of what is the inherent question here. Inherent question is that I want to use the pulse oximeter to decide whether to take the family member to the hospital or not, which means that my belief is that the readings would be accurate enough for me to take that decision. So that's why I put that as a third sub question. Will the readings be accurate to take decision? So notice how the main problem, should we buy a pulse oximeter, got broken down into 3 different sub questions. Now this is where that that framework of MISI comes into picture, which is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. So in this example, what it means is that if you look at the 3 branches, they're exclusive. The first branch is about financial payoff. The second branch is about timeline. The third branch is about the specific outcome that needs to get created, which is readings. That are the readings accurate or not? So there are 3 mutually exclusive branches. They are not related to each other. And collectively, they are exhaustive in my thinking, because the way I understood the problem, collectively, if I answer these 3 questions, they will give me an answer about whether I should be purchasing or not. So collectively put together, if I get answers, they are exhaustive. There is nothing else that I could think of if I break that particular problem. That's why they are called collectively exhaustive, the 3 branches. While mutually exclusive, because they are all 3 talking about 3 different aspects. And now what we do is that we further break it down. Is the payoff attractive financially? Will further get broken down. That cost is equal to 2,000 bucks and benefit I need to articulate. You know, I might choose, if I were to go down this path, I might say that the return is the money that I will save in an emergency procedure. Let's say that, you know, because I am able to monitor early, I am able to save on X amount of emergency procedure. So that's how this will, this can be further broken down into multiple other branches. And it goes on till you hit the end and you say that, okay, fine, this is a branch which looks like good enough for me to now start analyzing or go to the next step. Till then you keep breaking down. But the beauty of this entire process is that a complex problem gets broken down into solvable parts. Usually when we try to look at problem at the level of how do I retain my top 50 talent in a COVID world, it looks like a little bit daunting that I can't engage with them the way I used to. It looks like a daunting problem. But the moment you start breaking it down, you start looking at these branches, they start giving you a feel that, yes, I can do this. That's what it does. So that's MISI. That's the MISI part of the issue tree. But I think what I want you to remember is, while MISI is good, the main thing that we are doing here is breaking down the issue into solvable parts. There is another way, which is called hypothesis tree. So instead of putting these as questions, in that approach, you try to put a hypothesis, which is an answer. So my first part, instead of saying, should we buy a pulse oximeter, it might read like, we should buy a pulse oximeter because it will save money. So that's a hypothesis. It's not a question, it's a hypothesis. I'm putting forward a view that I believe that this is how it would look like. And then you break it down and you say that buying pulse oximeter can result in savings of 50,000 to 1 lakh rupees. So now here I have put a hypothesis. Hypothesis is an assumption which I believe could be true. And then what you do in your work going forward is you try to prove or disprove that hypothesis. So these are two different approaches. You can either put a question, which is take the main problem, break it into sub questions, or you can put a hypothesis and that's how you could go. Either of the two are fine. Step number 3, once you have done that, you have to prioritize. You can't work on everything. Most often what happens is that in any issue tree, there are certain branches which are more important than the others, depending on what criteria you're applying. So in this case, I'm just giving it as an example that probably the financial payoff and the accuracy of the reading, in my mind, in the mind of the person who articulated that problem, are higher compared to the second one, which is it worth purchasing in 30 days? So I might say that no, actually, if you ask me, the 30 days is more of an artificial timeline. It can be 45 days also, it can be 15 days also. So I cut it out and I say that fine, this particular branch can be cut it. Now this cutting or prioritization can happen at this level, or it can happen at a branch which comes later. But the whole idea is that as a team, when you're solving a problem, you should not be solving each and everything with equal intensity. You always would be limited by time available, by resources which are available to you in terms of people, by the money which is available. So if the resources are limited, how can you spend equal amount of time on everything where the impact is not equal? So, and that's what I wrote separately, that usually this prioritization is based on impact. That what if I solve for this particular branch? How much additional impact will I be getting? And if the impact is low, you cut that branch. And second is efforts or cost, that how much of effort would it be required for me to get an answer to this particular branch? That is the second input that goes into deciding whether you should be going down this path or not. So that's the third step, which is prioritization, where you look at the impact that particular branch will create. You look at the constraints in terms of people, time, and money, and you try to remove certain branches because they do not require that much of attention from your side. Step 4, work plan. Now this is where whichever branches you have selected, you try to create some sort of a work plan. Now this is just one way of developing work plan. You can do it you can use multiple tools for this. So I'm not so fixated here about the tool, but what is the main objective? Main objective of the work plan is then to do some sort of an allocation amongst the teams, which is saying that who will focus on which particular activity or analytic within a particular branch, coming to some sort of alignment in terms of time management by when a particular activity will get done, and also from a source perspective, where will insight be generated? So if I have to do a particular analysis, where all would I be going for that particular data source, etc. So that's one aspect. There are two more aspects which I want to share. I'm just looking at the time. I think we have a good amount of time. So let me ask this question. Looking at this sheet, and I'm sure that this is one step that you would have done n number of times in your experience in solving a problem or working on a project. What else comes to your mind when it comes to benefit from creating a work plan? Why should we be creating a work plan? Dependencies, drive, accountability, clarity, time and effort distribution, action mindset, measurement and tracking, alignment. I'm just reading all the tracker and ownership, more clarity, Racy or Rasi, however you pronounce that. Okay. Critical path. Managing expectations. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. It was also a way to check if everyone is there or people have put this session on mute and started doing something else. So I'll give couple of, I think, so these are all the right answers, I would say, based on your experience. So now I'll add two more things from my experience. One is that it is at the work plan stage where you try to create some sort of an iteration, which is where I have tried to display it with that yellow circle. Because in the work plan itself, you try to build in those reviews that need to happen in between. A review at your team level, a review at a superior team level, as in your boss. Because that in the work plan, if you're not building in those discussions where you need to get inputs and feedback, then basically it's a plan to do analysis independent of other people's view. And that's why in the circle I've written biases. Because in the work plan stage itself, if you're building up those check-ins with your customer or your peers or your superiors, that's where you are able to check for the biases. Say for the payoff, like in this particular screen, I do a specific analysis and I come out with a solution. Then in the work plan itself, I should be adding a timeline as well as an activity where I'm getting a review from my audience, let's say my family member, that I will be doing a check-in with my family members on so-and-so date. And then I come back in the work plan and I add that I will do a second set of analysis after that feedback. So it's important that in the work planning stage itself, you are building that iteration element, that here is how different check-ins would be made with stakeholders, whether they are customers, they are peers, or they are your superiors, so that you can come back and iterate. That's one. Second is what I call it as a level 1 or a level 2 answer. So, and this is again an example I would give, I learned from McKinsey. So McKinsey would always force us to say what is the day 1 answer. And I used to get kind of boggled down by day 1. What do you mean? I don't even know anything. How can I give a day 1 answer? But it worked well. It worked well in the sense that it used to force the team in the direction of answer, which we are trying to refine by using a work plan. Compare that to doing a large amount of analysis and coming to an answer on day number 90. The difference is that the work planning, it helps in further prioritizing what needs to be done and what should be avoided when you force yourself for a level 1 answer or a level 2 answer. That day 1 is almost like a level 1 answer. That if you ask me, my day 1 answer is no, don't buy pulse oximeter. That's my level day 1 answer. Day 2, I will add some analysis on top of it and I'll try to again answer. Okay, there is a case to buy a pulse oximeter, because if I look at this particular data, which came on day 2, and this particular analysis which team did, it seems that it's not that really a bad idea to buy a pulse oximeter, and so on and so forth. So work planning helps you in generating your answers at multiple level of detail, and it helps you in deciding at what level I have to stop and till when we need to continue. And second, work planning also helps in removing the biases if you are able to build in those reviews. So those are two additional elements I'm adding. I think others, I completely agree with whatever has been said in the chat, that if you look at this sheet also, fundamentally it is helping you allocate the task, track the progress, and also clarify what analytics need to be done in one sheet. It becomes that tracker. Okay, step number 5.
So a question, if you say day 1 answer is, your level 1, does that mean then that means you're playing into your heuristics?
Yes, that's what we already do, no? That
yeah.
When we launch into any particular problem solution, we always start with some sort of a heuristic or a bias that we might have, basis which we are coming out with a conclusion. Like I said, I might come with a heuristic or a bias that any kind of monitoring at home is useless. Based on which I said, that it doesn't make sense to buy a pulse oximeter. Now that's my bias, and that's based on my heuristic, which I created, that based on my past experience, any kind of monitoring at home using a device is useless. So that's my day one answer. Day two, I might be having more data and analytics, which would have given me some insight, which might help me change that day one answer and say, okay, while I believe that in most cases monitoring at home is useless, in this case, there might be some relevance. Does that clarify?
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Super. Number 5, analytics. So analytics itself, I think of as a 4 or 5 step process where what you are trying to do is, one, you are trying to collect data, which could be relevant. 2, you are then cleaning up that data. 3, you are doing some sort of a data modeling. And 4, you are doing some sort of an insight generation. Now, even in case of problems where we are not talking about numbers, principally you do something similar. You still collect some sort of a data, even if it is qualitative. It could be through interviews, that I interviewed 5 people who have used pulse oximeter at their home, and I got their view. That's data collection. Data cleanup. In this case, when I'm interviewing, cleanup means that there were interviews where people gave me gyan, but they did not have a pulse oximeter. Remove that from this thing. Data modeling in this case, in a qualitative case, could be that, okay, fine, now let me try to bring some sort of a, I would still call it a model, but let's say that in an Excel sheet itself, I write the names of people who are interviewed. Then I wrote 4 or 5 parameters around which I am gonna put their responses, and I wrote that. How many people said yes to it is worth if it is under 2,000 rupees, so on and so forth. I think you got the gist, but what I'm trying to say, that even in a qualitative scenario, you are doing some sort of analytics around that, how many people said this, how many people said that, etc., and trying to do that analysis. And the fourth one is most important for me in this step, which is insight generation. A lot of time we leave at data modeling, that once an Excel sheet is ready or once some output is ready, a survey output is ready, here is what it is. But fourth is where most energy should be spent in this particular step, which is insight. What are those aha moments? What is it that you are generating through this work which you did not know? And this is where you check your biases. If you are not generating insights, that means that the work you did in so far was to confirm your bias. I believe that, as an example, if I believe that monitoring at home is useless, a lot of my analysis would be to prove that. I will come back and say, look at this data. See, 80% of the people I interviewed said that it's useless. So if the insight did not come, why? Why did they say so? If the insight is not coming, then I'm only confirming my bias. So insight generation is the most important part of this whole analytics piece. Sorry, someone was saying. Hi.
This is Prasad here. Any data is related to a context, right? So whenever we can capture data, there is a context related to it. Now, most of these, when we talk about data modeling or say looking at data which is historical, it generally doesn't capture the context. Okay. And when you actually come to non-routine problems, there may not be data which explains that non-routine problem, right?
Can you give an example?
So, say COVID, right? We don't have anything which is there in the past, right? And when we talk about analytics, right, it would only be based on these data which may not be complete, right? And also if we have to develop a model which either gives you predictive or prescriptive analytics or insights, it requires some good amount of data before the model actually predicts it in the right way. So in such case, for non-routine problems, how would analytics really help, rather than just confirming probably what you think may be the case?
Sure. And Prasad, before I answer that, can you go further and say that COVID is more like a macro scenario? Can you articulate a problem that in COVID times, how do I solve for X. What is the X?
Okay, so during COVID, what is the number of beds that say a city like Mumbai has to have so that people are treated without rejection, or say X% rejection?
Got that. So, so let's take this example, and this can be applied in multiple other scenarios where we are looking at, in the organization context also, we are looking at how do we come out with data modeling. So in this case, practically what would happen is that you would use a combination of past data and something which is not based on past data. So let me take this example from a past data perspective. So while COVID has not happened, I would try to look at similar kind of pandemics that have happened and how they have progressed in a city like Mumbai. And I would try to see that there how many beds were required in the past at a particular rate. Second, I would try to look at, again, from a data from another country perspective, that if I look at another city which is as densely populated as Mumbai, how many beds did they require at the same prevalence level or same incidence level as is happening in case of Mumbai. So if I draw a curve for Mumbai, the number of cases, the way they are rising, and if I try to plot that curve with another city which is as densely populated as Mumbai anywhere else in the world, I would try to get that kind of a data and do that comparison. So first method is past. Second method is some sort of a benchmarking. And the third is where you try to bring in that qualitative aspect where you see that, okay, let me also do the modeling, which is more based on qualitative interactions with experts. That what are experts saying that on a per capita basis for COVID, what's the right number of bed? So it's a, while I mentioned to you methodology, but in most complex problem solving, the method consists of a past data plus some sort of benchmarking plus some sort of a expert view. Expert view could be coming from, like in this case, coming from people who are health experts, people who are experts in another country or who have been through that, like in say in an organization context, talent retention. Let's say one organization is able to solve the problem in COVID in the next 3 months. So that organization or the HR head there could become an expert, and you might want to contact that particular person as well. So it's a combination in these cases of past, benchmarking, and expert view. And again, this is where a bit of creativity also comes in, that while you need to do some sort of data modeling, how you do that is also left to your creativity.
Correct. Yeah, because one is in terms of the data itself, and then when the context is different, right? If you look at past also and today, the context is something which is different and is evolving, right?
Yes.
So that is where probably the experts we would come in with some bias, probably.
Yeah, of course, of course.
Thanks.
No problem. So we'll move forward. I will take all the questions in 3 or 4 minutes, because otherwise we won't have time for case study. So just hold on to it or just type it, because during the case study also I'll have time to go through. I'll just finish this up. What this analytics does is that it further gives you a better sense of the day one answer, which I was talking, that your day one answer gets refined once you do this step, and a day two answer, which is better than a day one answer or backed by facts rather than opinion or biases, comes as an outcome. Second, it helps in pressure testing, which is that if I am saying that any kind of monitoring at home is useless, I'm able to pressure test that assumption by using data. That unless there is a data to back this, on what basis am I saying this? Is that really a bias or is that really a fact? And the third is when I wrote digital, I think to what Prasad said, I anyway wanted to share that now the tools have also become very sophisticated. So you can use n number of tools depending on what kind of problem you're solving for, where they can give you a much better answer. So instead of just using a simple spreadsheet, you can use a combination of multiple digital tools, which can help make the both data modeling and insight generation part in particular easier, but for data collection, data cleanup, every step, now there are tools that can be used. I'll move to the 6th and 7th step quickly, and then we'll have time for a few questions, but then I'll take more questions in the case study. Synthesis. So synthesis is nothing but, what's there on the page is almost like a collection of insights which are there as a result of your previous work. So when you do analysis number 1, there would be 2-3 insights. When you do analysis number 2, there would be another set of insights, and so on and so forth. And if you try to synthesize what does it mean, what is the message, then you would have a collection of those synthesis as part of your work. That when I worked on the analysis around the financial trade-off or financial payoff of having a or buying a pulse oximeter, I generated 3 insights. From those 3 insights came out my main message that, okay, my main message or main synthesis is that as long as the pulse oximeter is under 2,000 rupees, the financial trade-off is 3 to 4 times, which means that I'm able to make or save 3 to 4 times the money that I'm investing. So that could be synthesis 1. That out of all the work, here is my main message. So at the synthesis stage, you try to generate as many messages which are some sort of a better version, precise, sharper version of the insights that you generated so far. Synthesis is not summary. Synthesis is almost always not just a summary that this is what I did, this is what I did, this is what I did, this is what I did. That's basically summarizing what you did. Synthesis is that as a result of whatever you did, what are the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 messages that are coming out, which look like at a insight level, a collection of insight. That's what synthesis is. So unless you are able to collect those insights and articulate them so that they look more like insight, it's more of a summary rather than synthesis. So that's the step number 6, which is synthesis. And step number 7, communication. I added the word for action. This is where your main objective is not just to communicate what you did, but also to test out whether this can result in an action or not, whatever you are communicating. So the graphic here is what we call as a pyramid principle. So it's a pyramid. So start with a main message, which is, I use this terminology, seed for motivation, seed of motivation. That your main message should almost, when you articulate that, should motivate the person to take action. So my main message could be, pulse oximeter must be bought in the next 30 days if it is costing less than 2,000 bucks, because it can save lives with a probability of 50 to 60%. Now, when I articulate this as my main message as a result of all my work, there is a high chance that it will result in an action which is purchasing the pulse oximeter. I can also articulate it in the reverse way, that there is no point buying a pulse oximeter irrespective of what the cost is, because the accuracies are debatable. Again, from an action perspective, here you are not purchasing, but you have decided that I don't have to purchase. So either of the two is an action. Purchasing and not purchasing, but having a decision so that I don't have to put my mind behind this particular topic. Both are basically the outcome that I created through the main message. So if the main message is not resulting in your audience taking an action or a decision, then that means you have to work on that main message, which could be as a result of either the communication itself being weak, or it could be the analysis being weak, synthesis being weak, any of the previous steps. And that is the reason why this is part of the problem solving process itself, that when you communicate, which by the way is also the reason why consultants spend so much of time in making a chart, because chart is a way to communicate. When I'm communicating without any visual, it's very hard to explain what all I did. But with a visual, I'm able to communicate in a better way. And when I communicate, it almost always has to result in some sort of a decision that can be taken because of this communication. So that's on top. Below that, the pyramid principle says that first is the top, which is the main message. Then have 2 or 3 supporting reasons why you are saying so, which should be facts. And then you go down further. Reason number 1, again, you have got 2 or 3 supporting facts. So on and so forth, that when you come to the base, all the underlying facts or the sub messages, 8, 9, 10, those kind of messages could be there. but you always start with the main message and the 2 or 3 supporting reasons from a pyramid principle communication perspective, so that you know where you have to drill down. So when I'm communicating this to whoever I'm communicating, that person might say that, can you specifically tell me why you are saying reason number 3? So that person might have understood reason 1 and 2, but reason number 3 is where the person might want me to drill down. And that's where I might go deeper in my communication. The other 2 aspects are, 2 or 3 aspects. I think some of them I already covered. One is iteration. So this is a stage where the reason I'm communicating is because I want to know whether I need to iterate the full 6, 7 steps, or are we done? Communication is part of problem solving. I think this is something that I shared earlier also, that it is not an end outcome. It is part of problem solving. If action or decision is not being taken as a result of this communication, then that means you have to iterate. So that's it. I think these are the 7 steps, and I can do 2 things. I can take 3 questions. I think that's much time I have. And then you should share your questions if there are more in the chat window, but I would really like you to get onto a case study, and then we take more questions, because the case study itself will clarify some of the questions that you might have. So any 3 questions I can take right away.
Rahul, Selva here. I'll go first.
Yeah, Selva.
So the previous slide which you had day one message. So I didn't really have catch that. Is that a first emotional response to look at it and then look at cognitive response along fact? If you could explain what is day 1 response? And then this pyramid principle seems a little bit more complex than straightforward communication of for action. So it seems like a science by itself. So is this a decision point? It's almost like what decisions the person should take.
Okay, your voice has a little bit of echo, so I'll just first rephrase your question so that to make sure that I understood. I think the first one was more of a clarification that what do I mean by a day 1 answer, and the second one that you asked was that this pyramid principle, is this a decision point? Am I right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Day 1 answer is actually it is nothing more, nothing less, but a day 1 answer, which is basically saying that if the problem statement is should be by pulse oximeter, what is the day 1 answer? What do we believe right now based on whatever facts, data, knowledge that we have? So day 1 answer in this case is yes or no with some supporting fact. I don't know whether there was something more in the question or not, but day 1 answer typically comes with what we already know. And then a day 2 answer comes, then a day 3 comes, day 4 comes based on what additionally we are able to generate as insight. So in this case, if on day 2 I collected certain data, I analyzed it, I synthesized it, and now I know some additional fact, my day 2 answer might be different from my day 1 answer. So that's what day 1 answer is, that for the problem, what would I decide if I was forced to decide today without doing any analysis? That's what day 1 answer typically is. And then since you're doing this analysis, every day you should be having a slightly better version of that answer, which could be the same answer with more conviction, or which could be a different answer because now you have got a different set of data available. The second point, which is what you asked about this. So yes, this is a decision point, but usually what happens is that in typical complex problem solving process, you would have at least 2 or 3 rounds where communication is happening using this particular principle, where let's say that the entire project for you is a 6 weeks project. So in 6 weeks, you need to get answer to a specific organizational problem. So you would have the first round of communication after say a week or 10 days, and you will try to communicate an answer, which is a day 10 answer using this principle. Then and there itself, the organization might say, okay, based on this, if we had to take 3 or 4 decisions, one of them we can take now. Let's say that decision was about how much additional budget do we need for that particular problem. So organization might say that, okay, we now know we need to go to the board and take approval for this much additional budget. But there are 3 other questions, sub questions in that problem, which team to put, what capabilities we need, etc., which would come later on. So as I said, since it's part of the problem solving process, you would get some sort of a decision every time this communication would get made. Even if decision is not being taken, typically this is a point where as a team you decide how much of iteration is further required, how much off we are versus the solution. Okay, I'll take two more. How do we focus on after action review based on main communication or action proposed? That's what Manjula has asked. And Sri Vikas is how do we validate is the insights we have from analytics actually matches the on-ground reality? How do we validate? Okay, I'll take both of them and then we'll get into the case study. Otherwise, we won't get time for that. So the first one, which is how do we focus on after action review based on main communication? So I think it varies organization to organization. If I understood correctly, what I got a sense of was that if you are proposing, let's say it typically happens with us as an external consultant, it happens a lot, that if I propose a particular solution, if I propose a particular roadmap for action, how do I focus on the actual implementation after that? So it's outside these 7 steps. Once the 7 steps have been done and decision has been taken. So that's one scenario. So there, from an organization perspective, it totally depends on whether the organization wants to do a progress check after 3 months, 6 months, 10 months. That's how it is. Unless the organization wants to do that, the way we do it, I'll just share that as an example, that we typically, if it's a 3-month project, then we typically would ask our client to also schedule in advance a half yearly and a full year progress check, that after 6 months or after 12 months, what has been the impact. So it's basically A, driven by the organization, and B, driven by you. So in my case, in our case, for example, we drive in a lot of cases that let's do a check. That's how you do a after action review once the communication or solution has been proposed. So analytics matching or validating, I think I'll say it in 2 parts again, like the previous answer. See, one is why this is iterative. This is iterative because once you do an analysis, there is no other way for you to check before someone challenges you. So in step number 5, if you are doing the analysis, and 6 you are synthesizing, and 7 you are communicating, in the synthesis and communication step, someone should be challenging that I don't think so that your analysis is right, because what I know as a fact is this as a reality. So those are 2 steps where someone would be challenging. It could be either your team, it could be your peers, it could be your junior, it could be a superior. So that's one where the challenge happens typically. The second way is what you can control on your own as well, which is where for me the data collection and data cleanup step in the analytics step are so important, that your source of data is very, very important. I might be doing qualitative interview as a source of my data, but if I am not very clear about who I am interviewing, I am selecting people based on convenience, that I have got access to these 10 people, let me go and interview them, versus who are the right authorities to give me that data, to give me that insight. That would also decide how closer to the ground reality you are on.
Thanks, Rahul. I have a follow-up question, but I don't know. I'm cognizant of time. Let's see if we still have time. I'd like to pick this up. Otherwise, we'll see how we can get addressed.
Yes. So everyone else, please do mention your questions in the chat window. When you are working on the case study, let me go through those questions, and I'm going to cover them once we come back. What we should do is that we should launch into the case study now. I'm going to share the screen where the case study is mentioned. I'm going to explain what that case study is, and then you will be working in smaller teams. So here is a role play that you have to do. You are the HR head of ClientCo, which is a $1 billion organization from a revenue perspective and 1,200 people strong. It was making losses for 3 years, and last year it made profits once again. And then COVID happened. Now the board has asked the CEO to ensure that revenues do not fall by more than 20% this year. Further, they have asked to cover the gap in profits by reducing the cost of sales. What does that mean? That while the board is prepared that your revenues will take a dip, but what would happen is that if your cost structure remains the same number of people, salary, etc., then obviously you are achieving lesser sales at a higher cost, which means that your cost, if I reduce my cost, then only I can make same amount of profit which I made last year. So that's where the board has asked that reduce my cost of sales from 10% currently. So if for every 100 rupees that I was generating in sales, I was spending, let's say 10 rupees, board has asked that bring it down to 8 rupees after 6 months. The CEO in turn has asked you to develop the change management strategy that addresses 3 questions. Question 1, how can compensation structure be changed to reduce the fixed outflows while motivating high performers even more? Which means that think of the compensation structure and what modification you would make, but also be cognizant of the fact that you need to still motivate the high performers. It should not be that you change the compensation structure and my high performers no longer are motivated. Second question, how should change management be planned to minimize disruption to performance while also retaining top talent? Which means this is more about planning, that how should you be planning, what all components should be there so that your performance, which is your organization sales, is not disrupted, and at the same time your top talent is not leaving you. So what are the components of change management? That's the questions. Third, what risks need to be evaluated in this transition and how can ClientCo mitigate them as part of implementation? And risk could be performance related, risk could be organization health related. So it could be related to, when I say risk, it could be that some aspect of my P&L is getting impacted, or some aspect of my talent or people or culture could be at risk once I do the implementation. So these are 3 questions that you need to answer. Now, see what I've written, what I have put in as an ask. There are teams and your team needs to complete all 7 steps for any one of the 3 questions. So take any one of the 3 questions which are there on the screen and complete all 7 steps for that question. For other 2 questions, you need to complete step 1, 2, and 3, which is problem statement, issue tree, and prioritization. So these 3 steps you have to cover for all 3, while for any one of the questions, you have to do all the 7 steps. Now, I think the teams that we have thought of are going to be teams of 5. Given that we would have limited time, you have, by the way, we are looking at a very high level answer so that you just practice it. You will have 20 minutes for this. Divide your team in such a way that everyone is working on one aspect. Now the division, I leave it to you because that's also part of problem solving, that in a real world, you are not the only person, you are working in a team. So divide it in such a way that all what has been asked from you gets completed in 20 minutes and then you come back. How you divide, how you do it, I leave it to you. Again, we are looking at a high level answer. We are not looking at, the final answer. We want you to experience as a team the process. Let me now hand the control to Hina, who is going to display how the teams can work together.
So everybody, I will be dividing you in groups of 5, and so there will be around 10 breakout rooms. Each one of you will be part of one breakout room, and then you can work in that room, discuss, create a PPT, create a solution, and Rahul will be toggling between the breakout rooms to see what you all are discussing, doing. And at the end of 25 minutes, you come back, you come out of breakout room and join the main session. We all are going to be logged into this session for the next 25 minutes anyway.
Okay, Hina, I can't find you, so I'm making David the host.
Sure.
I have done that.
So David, you will be dividing or you are passing it on to me?
Hina, I think you've logged in with the name Shweta.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that's why I
No,
could
that's
not.
a default name basically.
Okay, I'll make you the host.
Now we have a bigger problem to solve.
Hina, are you the host now?
The real Hina stand up.
I am. Yes, I am. So just,
Okay,
just give me 5 minutes, guys. I'll take maybe 2-3 minutes to create rooms and then divide you, assign you, each one of you to the rooms. So Rahul, in the meantime, if you want to take some questions, maybe you can do that.
Okay, so before that, just a process check in that case. If you're taking 5 minutes, Hina, are we okay if this session extends beyond what time is it in India? 9 p.m. right? Yeah. So if it extends beyond 9 p.m.
We are okay if you are okay.
Yeah.
I'm sure participants are keen to listen to you.
Okay. Because usually I would prefer that you spend at least 20 minutes, but if you're okay, here is how it would happen. So after the case studies, I would want 3 groups to just share what they worked on, 5 minutes per group. So 15 minutes is there, and I would require another 5 to 10 minutes for conclusion. So 25 minutes is after the case study. So if I work backward from there, I can decide how much time you can take on the case study. So if you're okay to go till 9:30, for example, I think then we are fine. Yeah, I think one person has said that Sri Vikas has to drop off at 9. Anyone else who has to drop off at 9 strictly? I have to drop off at 9:10 for a call. Okay.
So,
Okay, Hina, whenever you are ready, we'll still go ahead because case study is very important. It's more important than me taking questions because unless people practice, the theory anyway doesn't help. So I prefer that whatever time we have, we at least use for case study.
right. Can you all see a breakout room on your window?
Yes, we are back. There was no choice to remain in the group for more time, otherwise we would have remained.
Yeah. Hina, we were forced to come back, Hina.
Yes, I know.
Okay, I'm sure you had some fun moments there, and some of you might have been able to also better understand what we covered in the session.
Rahul, just a practical question, just to understand, have you ever done this entire 7 steps in 20 minutes?
I have.
Okay.
Ask another person who I was just chatting to Ashok. We used to have a training called BCR, in which everything was crunched, and in that short time frame, we also had to conduct a client meeting as a role play.
Right. No, we are always told if you're able to do something in 20 minutes, if you would have at least invested about 10 years or 5 years doing that, only then the efficiency comes in. So we were just wondering about that.
So I think the idea anyway is not the efficiency part. It is also to add one element which always is there. That even if I make this 20 minutes into a 2-week exercise, at the end of the 2 weeks, you would feel like if I had more time, I would have created a better output. And that's what happens in the real world, that no matter how much time, resources as a team, as well as money we might have, we always would have the end situation like that I could have done better if I had more time. So that's one practical aspect, and that's why I wanted to make sure that we are experiencing it, even if it is for 15-20 minutes. Let's experience that there is additional constraint that would always be there in the ideal world, which is time. So before we get into the overall debrief and I answering any of the questions that were asked before we did a breakout, I would like to ask if there are groups which would want to share what they did. It's not an answer. I'm not expecting the answer. I just want to understand what the experience was. So when anyone comes in, just share which specific question you worked on and what was the experience of the steps. If you can share an output, that's great. If you can't share an output, that's also good. Anyone? Okay, Sarita is sharing.
Okay. So Rahul, this is Netra here. I think I'll start with the experience of the group. Firstly, we were not able to complete the entire exercise to begin with. And so that's why Jay asked you that question. We were a part of the same team. So we took the second question for deepening the problem statement around change management. And
Sorry, okay,
can you
fine.
hear me, Rahul?
I can hear you, but someone else was sharing the screen, so I got a bit confused. So now it's okay. Now it's okay. Please go ahead.
Okay. So what we did, I mean, in terms of the experience, we of course started with trying to agree roles amongst us, who will make notes, who is going to, keep time, and who's going to make decisions amongst us. So that was good. But then we started also trying to go into a little bit of a solution mode initially, and then we took a step back and said, no, let's first spend a little bit of time identifying the problem statement and breaking that up. So clearly the steps helped us in reining us through the thought process. So what we first did was we broke up that statement into three parts. And we said, okay, what is really important when we talk about change management in terms of a contingency, in terms of minimizing disruption to performance, and what do we mean when we say we're talking about retaining top talent in the context of the COVID scenario that was put forth. And then we went into breaking up the issues. Again, we spent quite a bit of time there. So we actually were rushed when we came to prioritization, synthesizes, and the analytics and the synthesizes. Yeah, so that part was a bit rushed. So we could not actually complete what our communication to our stakeholder is going to be. What is our final communication going to be? That bit we had to sharpen up a bit more. And if the team wants to add anything.
Good. Looks like you guys had a lot of fun in those 20 minutes.
Maybe, Netra, could you share a little bit of the snippets of what were the second statement we agreed and what the prioritization we quickly, could you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So the way we went about that, Rahul, was we said, so what does it really mean? We're talking about change management in the context of minimizing disruption to performance. And when we break that up, what are some of the issues we will face with regards to accepting change? Be that denial, there would be fatigue that we would be experiencing. How do you then retain top talent if there is already a reorganization taking place where there is a question of affordability and a mandate that comes to play? Then how do you retain where you have a time crunch? So these were some of the issues we spoke about. And then when we went into prioritization, we said, how can we take an inclusive view of ensuring that we are keeping all factions of the organization in mind, right? To keep the morale going. And then when we spoke about the work plan, we said, how is it that we can engage our thought leaders in keeping the top talent more productive? And also we spoke about performance management for the bottom performers. And then there was a really good point that came in around upskilling and reskilling, and what we can do to revamp the rewards program as well to keep staff motivated. So that was our thought process. I'm just conscious of time, Rahul, so please stop me. But this was really some of the thought processes that our team discussed.
Got that. And I think, again, there is no right answer to this problem. That's why I was more interested in the experience and some snippets that you shared about some of the steps. One takeaway I want to highlight from your description, and thank you, Netra, for going first, is the whole people element, which we other than time, what usually happens in a team scenario is that how do you manage different people and their own interpretation of the process? All of you went through all the 7 steps in exactly the same way, because I was the one who was sharing. The framework was same. In the real world, you would be dealing with people who would be having a different take on what approach should we be applying. So that's another complexity. But even without that, in this group, it took some amount of time to figure out who will do what and what each person's interpretation of each of the 7 steps was. And that's a very real world problem, that when you solve a problem with a team, some aspect goes in just aligning on what exactly do we need to do in step 1. Even though we might have read the same book, even though we might have attended the same course, your way of interpreting that problem statement might be different from mine. And that's very important to learn how to do that. And I don't have a theory there. It basically only comes by practice, that you do it again, and you understand how to do it in a team kind of a setting.
Rahul, this is Prasad. I would go next for the team comprising of Manurita, Manjula, Shweta, and Syed, and myself, of course. So, without actually going about what we actually did, because I am sure it would be just like what other groups did, right? A lot of confusions, each one at loggerheads, and then coming to something, right? So, I would just speak about the takeaways in the interest of time. What we felt was when we were discussing these problems, right, each one was bringing their view of it, which comes to show that it brings in the biases which you speak about, right, each individual's biases in defining a problem or seeing a problem in a certain way, right. And that is where at the end of the day we realize that it is better we stick to the problem statement and the step that would guide us rather than we each of us talking in a digressed way. That was one. The second thing is when we also look at this problem statement, we at times forget the bigger picture. What is the biggest in terms of what is the business impact, or what is that we are driving as a bigger picture. We zero in just in defining the problem and or look it at a very micro level, which may not address the macro problem. So that is another thing which we actually saw in these 15 minutes or 10 minutes of deliberation, right? And the third important thing, what we also felt was, as you rightly mentioned, right? There is no end state to it. There will be multiple problems, right? So list what you can do in terms of the issue breakup and move forward with it, right? Because when you start developing on each of these issues, would you make it more rich rather than waiting for a perfect solution? So those were the 3 top takeaways for us as a group.
Yeah.
Very well.
Okay. Yeah, Rahul, Anil here. We were in a group which had Shalini, Deepika, Mansi, and myself. I think 2 takeaways apart from what group has shared, I would not repeat, is one, I think such frameworks like what you shared, you keep oscillating between convergence and divergence. So at problem statement level, we were converging, we were being very specific, but at the issue breakup stage, we were into divergent thinking. And that's where we were being more inclusive and holistic as to what could be the possibility. And then in subsequent steps, we kept experiencing this. So I think this is one reflection for me. Even in a problem solving state, which normally is looked at in a very funneling down approach, but you keep oscillating between convergence and divergence. And I think this was a key reflection. Second, I think frameworks kind of help you stick to the boundaries and keep validating, are we on the right track without restricting your thinking. So by this, I mean, the moment we defined the problem statement, I think Deepika or Shalini mentioned that, we heard about success definition, constraints, and dependencies as some of the yardsticks to, go through to kind of test your problem statement. And that's where probably we went back to the framework, validated our problem statement, and moved forward. So that's why we felt that a framework keeps the boundary check of the direction, that are we moving in the right way. So I think these 2 reflections helped. And of course, we could not complete the whole activity. This was a challenge for us. But overall, these were the 2 reflections. And of course, Shalini, Deepika, and Mansi, if you want to add something more to these couple of points.
No, so that's helpful, Anil. And I want to pick that first point. That's how the steps are. I think if you look at design thinking, there also there is one work stream where you would converge and another work stream where you would try to bring divergent thinking. In these 7 steps, the issue tree is supposed to create the divergence, and synthesis as a step is supposed to bring the convergence. But then the whole iteration in the 7 steps means that even after you have converged, you go back and bring divergence if there is a need, because the communication is not leading to action or decision. So that's how it is. But thanks for pointing that out, and you experienced it as part of your session, means that you got that insight. Thank you.
Hi Rahul,
Faguni.
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah.
Faguni, you want to go next?
I was also about to point about Shuchi, given that she had messaged in the group that she wants to go next.
Yeah,
So let her,
no worries. We had a team. So Faguni, are you there? Not sure. Okay, Alok Parna?
Yes, I'm there. I think it was as a group, I think what we were looking to do, we did have a presentation created. And for us, very important was while there are already elements out there, putting that out in the steps and really looking at dependency. I think one of the key things that we're searching was really understanding the meaning of each step and applying. I think it took us a lot of iteration to get it right. Yeah, so we would want to obviously see how the answers pan out. And I think the second experience that we had was while there are 7 steps and we all understand each meaning of it, doing this for just one took us the entire bandwidth. Even distributing wasn't helping because there are just so many points of view. And I think one of the teams kind of brought that out. So we did go through the overall steps, but we kept looking back to say, did it make sense? Did it, is it collaborating? Is it collaborating with what we're talking about? Falguni, if you'd like to add.
Yeah, and Anil, thank you for giving words to what we experience. We also face this convergence and divergence issue, but in the end, we were just trying to somehow arrive at solution. Given the time that was there, so there was a lot of confusion initially. Rashmi?
Yeah, and I think the other takeaway also, Rahul, when you were explaining the frame, I think what also stuck to us as we were, getting deep dive and, getting into each step, I think the example that you gave, that kind of stayed on.
Yeah.
So I think the frame and going back to the example and then saying, okay, that's what we recall in that part of the process. I think that helped us in terms of, going from one step to another. So having an example to the frame helped kind of jog our memory also in terms of, okay, what does this really mean?
Understood. And, I want to take this up as a point also. One of the questions that someone asked was that why is the day one answer necessary? So this is the reason why day one answer is necessary, although it is coming out from a bias. But once you put on table one answer, it forces you to then challenge that rather than going into multiple directions because you don't have time. In this case, if you start with a day one answer, or in this case, I would say minute one answer, that in my first minute, I'm putting forward an answer. Then what you try to do is that you try to create challenges around that answer and try to focus and prioritize much more because you only have 20 minutes. The same thing if you expand, when it is about day one answer, then what you're doing is that you're putting forward an answer which could be a biased one, but it helps you prioritize because then you say that I have only 1 week to solve this problem. Here is day one answer. I'm going to challenge it, or I'm going to use my team to challenge it. So that's where there is a usefulness of day one answer in spite of the fact that it is coming from a bias. So one last group in case anyone wants to
Hi, Rahul. This is Shohini, and we had Srividya, Yogesh, Shweta, and Smita in our group. So the experience had been very similar, and Yogesh and Shweta, Smita, Srividya, you can join as well while I'm speaking. The experience has been very similar. We spent the maximum time in step 1 and 2. It was hard. By the time it was hardly like 5 minutes left
and we did the rest just because we wanted to go through it. But what we realized is that these are the two most crucial steps, because if you, and that's what we realized, that while you're doing it, because there was a boundary and a framework, you're asking questions in terms of what are some of the dependencies, constraints, what does success look like? So what does minimize performance mean? What does top team retention mean? So how do you quantify and what? So we had a lot of discussion around that. That also gave us an insight that there are a lot of dependency in terms of stakeholders buy-in and viewpoint. So a lot of places we were stuck that we can't take these decisions because we need to bounce these off to the real stakeholders who will tell us what does success look like. And hence these are certain open-ended questions that are still open. And hence, though we are the HR team, we can't take any decisions on these. And we can just talk about that these what we think, that we need to have these clarity on these questions. Same with the second step, when we are breaking down issues, that what is important and what really is going to be that is most important for the stakeholder, and that would lead to prioritization of the issue. So a lot of places we kind of hit the wall saying that we don't know the answer, kind of brought home the point that you had highlighted, that iterations are important. Level 1, level 2 meetings are important. And we realized that this cannot work only in a group, like an HR group, and within team members, you have to go back time and again and reiterate and ask those questions and get those decisions, because the dependencies and constraints are there. It has to come from the stakeholders rather than us. So I think we couldn't reach to any decisioning. It was all open-ended throughout, because we were just assuming, and we kept saying that, okay, we need to go back and ask this, we need to clarify. So that's how the experience has been. And that was also a aha moment, at least for me, and I think the others can talk about themselves, that you realize how important it is to go back and check and reiterate, and those meetings are with the stakeholders. So that's what I had an experience, and others, please feel free to add.
But thank you, Sohini, for articulating this. I think, and I can tell you with a lot of experience in doing this over and over again, I don't recall even a single project where I had felt that I had enough time to solve this problem. The amount of time was always crunched in relation to the kind of problem we were trying to solve for. That this problem needs more time. That had I been in a PhD university environment, I would have probably created a fantastic solution. But real world is very different. If I have to survive as an organization, COVID is not allowing me to take as much time as I want. Last 3 months, we have fought hard because in organizations, some of the other things also happened, right? In my last client, they had taken board approval for a AOP or an annual operating plan in March. COVID happened. Now board asked them the question. They had to revise the plan. And at the same time, Q1 was on, right? If Q1 is on, you can't take infinite amount of time to revise the AOP, go back to the board, get the approval, and at the same time, make sure that your Q1 is not affected, which meant that in a normal situation, if preparing an annual operating plan takes 4 months of iterations and pressure testing and all those things, the same thing you have to do in just 20 days. Right? So that's how real world is. That no matter which situation we are talking about, most cases would be like this only, that at the end of the day, you would feel like I have less time, and hence step number 3 of prioritization is so critical, so critical. If I go back to what I was sharing earlier, that it's a combination of how much of impact a particular branch will create and how much of time, resources, and budget I have to put into that. You would always have that scenario, and hence that step 3 is very critical.
And Rahul, do you think?
Rahul, I would also, sorry, Suchi, go ahead.
So Rahul, I just want to ask candidly, where did we go wrong? What could have been done better? Is there any response against which we can kind of map and evaluate our workings?
So I won't articulate as a right or wrong. As I said, even the approach, I didn't analyze whether the issue tree is right or not. Even my issue tree, when I was sharing, whether it's right or not, it's just one way. And as I said, this one will only come from practice and practice and practice, that how you are able to prioritize better. The time element, I'm saying that since it's a given that you would always feel that time has been short, you only learn to prioritize by practicing. The more you practice, the more you learn how to prioritize. Next time when if I do this session again, you might be able to achieve more in same amount of 20 minutes. Next time you would achieve even more. So it's basically, now you know what you could have done differently, like this example that I gave. If you start with minute 1 answer, probably you might have done more. It could be. And you might have a different take on it. You might say, no, we could have allocated roles better. We might have said that, okay, let's each of us work on, say, step number 1, all of us do together, but then step number 2, you do, step number 3, you do, etc. That's another way. So I would say it's only by practice that you understand what the dynamics of the groups are that you are working in, and you are able to do better.
So Rahul, I have a
Rahul, I just
question.
wanted to say that just doing this thing together and using the approach, especially the critical points which you said, like mutually exclusive, what does success look like? Those really stayed, and that's made us test whether, what we were saying, is it right or not. So those are very, very helpful. And especially the communication part, that, what will sell our problem, our solution, what will convince action.
So Rahul, I have a question. This is with respect to, since you said practice. So as a McKinsey consultant, is it necessary, that you have to be a subject matter expert? For example, we are from the HR industry, so we understand, a lot of aspects related to. But, since you've, as a consultant, can you be working in divergent industries like, finance, real estate? So, or is it necessary for you to be a subject matter expert to be actually doing a problem solving?
So to get started, you don't. When I said get started, I mean at this level where we did the discussion, plus when you tried to look at this particular case study, although it was related to an HR head, some of you might not have any exposure to the 3 questions that I gave, which is okay. It doesn't mean that you can't create an issue tree, you can't do some level of prioritization. But when it comes to meaningful insights, it's very difficult to do it without subject matter expertise. So if you are not the subject matter expert, you need those experts in your team. Either full-time team members should be, some of them should be subject matter expert on the topic on which the problem is getting solved, or you should be having access. So in my case, for example, I always make sure that I am reaching out to experts on the subject on which I am working on, whether it's a sectoral problem or it's a functional problem. And it's not just my version of the solution. So either way, you need people who have seen it, because while I might be able to bring a fresh perspective being a generalist in a particular case, although I also over time have developed subject matter expertise in certain sectors and certain topics. But wherever I don't have, I do make sure that other than the generalist view, I am also bringing in a subject matters view by connecting with them.
Rahul, is this the stage? Do we do this in the stage of analytics, as in when we are gathering data, or is that the stage that we do this, or how do you see that? Do we do that even before we do work on the problem statement and look at dependencies? Where do you think? Yeah.
So as I said, it's an iterative process. So you might have to do it depending on where the gap is. It could be that when I'm doing the issue tree, which is step number 2, I could not think of a branch. I thought of 3 branches, but there's a 4th branch. And that 4th branch I could not think because I don't have subject matter expertise. I was looking at it as a generalist. It could be at the level of analytics where the branches are right, but when I'm doing the analytics, I'm getting stuck because I don't know how to do an analysis in a specific area where I don't have expertise. So since it's iterative, you would, and as I said, which is very important, that when you're communicating, if it is not leading to a decision, that is a signal that somewhere in one of the steps there is something missing, which could be expertise, which could be analytics, which could be anything, depending on what your answer is. So I won't say that it is at a specific step. It could come in at any step that you might require, because when you take the iterative cycle, you will try to see where I need to bring in an expert in which particular step when I'm doing the next iteration.
So Rahul, in this context, do we need to, like, there's always a pressure, especially when we are working in a strategy consulting, like you have level 1 in Bain, we had concept called answer first. And, the partners would always push that, what's the answer first? So even without being a subject matter expertise, and in strategy consulting world, we have seen that mostly people are starting their career as a generalist, because, that's how the cases are also allocated. So is there a kind of a pressure point, or even when I am handling my portfolio, to have this level 1 answer correct, or to have an answer first which will lead to my conclusion, where it is kind of syncing up with the hypothesis? So the question is that, do we need to have the subject matter expertise to arrive at a level 1 or a answer first approach, number 1? And number 2, is there a kind of a compulsion that whatever is our level 1 or answer first, we actually get that in sync with our problem solving approach as and when we progress?
Okay, so after this, by the way, I'll take one more question, given that we are already out of time. But on this one, see, some of you also asked it in the chat. The purpose of level 1 is more around prioritization, that we have a solution orientation. That if I force you to give an answer which is a level 1 or a day 1, it is forcing you to first put a solution and then work backward from there and refining that particular solution. That's my point number 1. Point number 2 is that when you do that, you have also put your bias upfront on the table. That I am coming in from some sort of bias, some sort of a heuristic, which I want other members in the team to challenge. So once I have done that, I have avoided a lot of rework which might come later, because otherwise what happens that, let's say if I am the team leader and I have a particular bias, I believe that this is the answer. I will let the team work. When they have put in effort of 6 weeks, they come with an answer. I will say, no, this is not the answer, because I believe this.
Got
I'm
it.
putting the confirmation bias after 6 weeks. It saves a lot of rework for the team if I put a day 1 answer upfront and I ask the team also that, okay, let's all put it on day 1. It avoids a lot of rework later. So that's how I would respond on that. I think I have also covered most of the questions, except for one, which was slightly different from what we did just now, which was that in the video that we saw, what Elon Musk gave as an example of first principle problem solving, which was about the battery case. It was not really a complex and uncertain scenario. Still, we are talking about first principles being applied there. And I agree that over time, what happens is that once you practice, you start applying this methodology much faster in multiple other scenarios. It could be in simpler problems also that you're solving at your home, related to relationships, related to any other work, related to your own personal growth, that you apply this framework by default. That's one point. The second point is that the reason I brought that element of that it's best fit in a complex, uncertain kind of an environment is because it takes a lot of effort to do it right. If I start applying it in every situation, I would not have the energy and the mind space to do this whole 7-step process in simpler problems. So that's why I would apply heuristics. Most startup founders like Elon Musk, they are challenging what has been told to them as fundamental. That the battery example was that. All of us believed batteries to be like that. He challenged that by applying the first principles, and he was able to create something new. So wherever innovation is happening, you would see that it might not be a complex and uncertain situation. It could be a case for innovation that you are challenging the status quo, and that's where you are applying the same thing as well. So that's one of the questions that I had not taken earlier. The last thing from my side, and then I would look at Hina and Santosh to also help me wrap up, is that the best problem solvers, they are not only solving the problem, they are also they also have the ability to make others feel that they solve the problem. So while you learn this technique, when you go out in the team, it's important that you are able to let your team feel that they worked on specific steps and they arrived at both the approach as well as the solution. That's where you would be able to achieve far higher success, because most of you, you are either in a leadership position or you will be going towards a higher leadership position. Your team will not look at how brilliant you are. That, oh, she was or he was able to apply these 7 steps and she was able to arrive at the answer. Your team would feel much more grateful if you're able to make them apply these 7 steps and make them feel that they generated the answer. So that's a skill that I'm, asking you to go or aim towards once you have learned this process. On that, I would say that it's not something that you can start applying right from tomorrow. But the only request I would have is that see if you can practice more and more first on your own, so that you master these 7 steps in a complex problem solving situation. And then gradually you will be moving towards a case where you can impart this to others. That's it from my side. Over to you,
Rahul, a lot of people have already dropped off, and you can see in the chat window the poll that you wanted to do, it already has answers. Some of the people actually have pinged me on WhatsApp and said that they just love the session. In fact, 1 or 2 groups, they are meeting after this session to solve this problem in a little bit more detail, because they thought that 20 minutes is less. We want to spend some more time on it. So let me know if you still want me to go ahead and do that poll. I will frame the
I think
question.
that was the purpose. I wanted to just get a sense of whether this session was useful.
Yes, they absolutely loved it. Probably Santosh can wrap up, and maybe we are good to go.
Thank you so much. Brilliant session. You would possibly be able to connect some of the dots when Rahul mentioned that have the answers on the day 1, which connected to your earlier research methodologies where you have assumptions. Remember, you had asked this question, how do we have assumptions in the beginning itself? And then you are cross-checking whether the assumption is right or wrong, which was one methodology, right? Another methodology Professor Ravindran said was you walk in without an assumption. And that also works. So here, what we are looking at is that you have answers on the day 1, so you have some assumptions because you know about it. And then you are collecting data to prove. And there are multiple people in the team who would have multiple assumptions, so that when everybody shares, you get a collective reality. And then you're using data to prove it or disprove it. So you will get like this multiple perspectives, so that it's not just one methodology. You have access to multiple ways of looking at something, and you can choose and master each one of these and then decide which one comes handy for you. That's it from my side. Good night. Thank you everybody for your great participation, great questions, great engagement, and see you all day after tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rahul.
Thank you, Rahul.
Santosh,
Thank you, everyone.
Motivating.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Santosh.
Thanks, Rahul. Thanks, Santosh. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.